Okay. Well, tonight we're going to have a guest speaker, Ashley Edwards. He's Executive Director of the Hancock County Port and Harbor Commission. And he's going to speak a little bit about research methods from the local level perspective. What do they do at local economic development organizations? A couple weeks ago, we had some full-time economic development analysts, David Rose from Entergy and Stevie Cantrell from MDA, talking about what kind of market research, economic development research they do. So I think it'll be interesting to compare what they had to say versus Ashley at the local level, what kind of research we do. And just a year ago or so, Ashley was in your seats. He was a star pupil, won our honor graduate for economic development, and has done great things. He's probably not going to mention it. Top 40, under 40 in economic development, prestigious award recently, and I think a rising star in the economic development field. So, Ashley, would you please talk to us a bit about market research at the local level?
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Dr. Miller. I really am honored to come and talk to the class tonight, and as I go through the slides, you guys feel free to stop me either by speaking up, or if you'd like to write in the chat box, I'll keep an eye on that. So if you have any questions, let's make sure it's very conversational. Don't hesitate to let me know. As Dr. Miller mentioned, I work at the local level. I have a little bit of past experience working at the state level. I'll give you a quick rundown of kind of who I am. I know I've got a chance to meet some of you guys and have some friends here in the class, but for those of you that don't know me, I've been the Executive Director of the Hancock County Port and Harbor Commission since about October of 2013, and prior to that, I spent 8 years working for the last two governors in Mississippi, overseeing the Katrina recovery in South Mississippi, and also overseeing disasters across the state. So with that in mind, one of my many jobs was overseeing about $5.5 billion of community development block grant funding, which is something I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and CDBG funding is certainly something you'll hear a lot about during your careers. And of course, I have my master's degree in economic development from the University of Southern Mississippi, and I actually have a background in communications. My undergraduate degree is from Tulane University. I actually attended both USM and Tulane undergrad, and I have a communications degree. And I think you'll find that about a lot of folks that work in the profession, a lot of the practitioners that you will run into probably did not come from a background of either economics or economic development, and many of them got into the career from some other path. And so it's really, for those of you that haven't gotten into your careers yet, you'll have quite a head start on everybody, because you'll walk out with a lot of knowledge and a lot of skills that have taken other folks many, many years to develop. A little bit about the agency that I work for. The Hancock County Port and Harbor Commission is really a very unique agency in Mississippi. We would actually be, if we were an economic development agency alone, we would be the largest in the state of Mississippi, but we also are an operations agency. Many of the EDOs that you guys will interact with, that's sort of what they do. They come to work every day and they do economic development. But we also own a port and an airport, and have to actually operate a port, an airport, and a short line railroad while providing economic development services for Hancock County and for NASA's Stennis Space Center. So we have about 39 employees, a yearly budget of about $8 million. I think it's a really good type of an agency to work for, because the experience is not only in developing the assets, but also making sure that you can operate them sustainably after they're developed, and that's what we get to do every day. So it's actually quite a good job, probably the best one I've ever had. Certainly not to say that working in the governor's office wasn't a good job, but it is a lot of fun, very exciting, and the things that you get to work on every day, really make you want to get up out of bed and come to work in the morning. At least that's what I tell my commission. Let me stop there. Anyone have any questions before we go on to the next slide? All right, what I've included here are just some pointers that I want to use to kind of get the slideshow started. I've written my 5 commandments for economic development. I think some of you guys will do the very same thing before you graduate the program. And what we're going to talk about a lot tonight is commandment number 1, which I've got written here: conduct data-driven economic development, focused on objective measures of a community's strengths that can be easily measured, communicated, and understood. And that's a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight as I go through this. I'm a big believer in data-driven economic development. I think a lot of the problems that we have in the economic development industry stem from the fact that we don't always have good, solid data behind the public policies that guide economic development and ultimately drive location decisions and incentive decisions. And using even basic economic analytics when you're working in a community will allow you not only, number 1, to understand your local economy, but number 2, to really accurately target the next steps for success. And tonight, a lot of what I'm going to talk about are the types of specific data sets that I use and that other local economic developers use, so that we can really go to work every day and put together a strategy that will ultimately be successful for our community. Before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about what data-driven development is not. And this is really one of my pet peeves, I think, about people in the economic development industry. A lot of economic developers, when they give their reports on their efforts, they really track output measures. And I've listed some examples of that here: the number of contacts made or assisted, the number of meetings or presentations that have been held, information packets that are distributed, trade shows that are attended. And trade shows are one of my real pet peeves. Very seldomly do the deals get done at trade shows, but all economic developers attend a lot of them. And really what we're talking about are measures of day-to-day activity. They focus on showing that they're trying very hard in their job, and while that's certainly an admirable thing, it's not a good strategy if you want to be successful in this environment. And as you can see that I've written down there, the economic development world does not reward efforts, it rewards results. And of course I've got my friend Yoda there. Trying is not the way to success. Creating outcomes is the way to be successful. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about analytics. Analytics is basically the discovery of communication and meaningful patterns in data. And I think that is really the key to being good at this side of the career path. You have to be able to not only see the data, but understand and really interpret and analyze that data, and then use that to guide your decisions, to guide your economic development strategy. Obviously, it's a multidimensional discipline, extensive use of mathematics and statistics. I'll tell you, I'm not a great mathematician by any stretch of the imagination. I've never been a person that enjoyed math, but I do like data analysis. And so even for those of you that aren't really big math fans, I think that what you'll see in the slides to come is that you don't have to be a mathematician to really be able to grasp the basics of this. And I'm sure that you guys have talked quite a bit about economic base theory. In fact, as Dr. Miller mentioned earlier, last month I received an award as one of the top 40 under 40 developers in the country, and they sent a questionnaire to me, and on that questionnaire one of the questions was, what do you think is really important for young economic developers in the profession? And the way I responded to that question was to talk about the need to really understand economic base theory. In many ways, it is the sort of the core on which our profession is built. And understanding the difference between non-basic activity in a local economy and basic activity in a local economy, or even a state economy or a national economy, I think is something that's crucial for all economic developers. And I think if you're around an economic developer and you say, what is economic base theory, or even if you say, what is basic economic activity, and they can't answer it, chances are they don't understand the fundamentals of their local economy. So let's just quickly review this. Activity which meets local demand is non-basic activity. And I will give you an example of that. if there's, for example, if you're in a local market and you have a fast food restaurant there, and primarily the customers of that fast food restaurant are folks that live in the local market within a very short drive of that market, then essentially that is non-basic activity. Think of it like this. It's dollars that are recirculating inside a community, dollars that are already inside a community that recirculate inside that community. And then by contrast, basic activity is activity which meets non-local demand. And the way I like to describe that is it's activity which brings new dollars into an area that would not be there otherwise. They would not be there but for the activity, the economic activity that's occurring. So a big difference there, non-basic and basic. You could break that down and oversimplify it by saying, for example, retail is often non-basic and say manufacturing is often basic. But those are not hard and fast rules because, for example, in a tourism-based economy, retail certainly can be a basic activity because it's what's attracting a lot of money into the community that wouldn't be there otherwise. But at least for the purposes of our discussion, let's think of it in terms of either money that's recirculating in a community that was already there or new money that's being brought into the community that wouldn't be there otherwise. And I'll stop there just to see if we have any questions. Okay, as I move on here, I've talked about some retail analytics, and I'm going to be using some actual Hancock County numbers. I'm sorry, I see that I have a question here. Serge wrote, could that be due to the fact it is hard to guarantee results in ED? Take business recruiting, for example. Can you really guarantee when you will get a prospect? Can you really do otherwise in that field other than showing results as activities undertaken? Serge, I think that is certainly one reason for it. You know, I think that you know, obviously day-to-day measures of activity are very easy because, you know, essentially it's not results focused. And so if we can show that we've worked really hard, that we've been very active, it's sort of an easy way to show that we're doing our jobs. But when you start looking into this economic data, really you should be seeing positive impacts and positive changes in the data over time. And so even if you're not necessarily landing new projects that are big showcase projects, being able to show that a number of small wins, a number of small economic improvements is starting to affect the overall economy is another way that you can demonstrate that you're successful. And certainly, you know, economic development is not a career path that in which you're guaranteed success. It's very difficult. Competition is very heavy. In many ways, we're in a jobless economic recovery now. And with that in mind, you don't see as many new locations. You don't see as many sort of new manufacturing facilities that are being built. And with that in mind, as time moves on, a lot of communities are also becoming much more sophisticated in their economic development activities. And so competition is extremely high, and it's difficult to be successful. But I think that what you'll find is the folks that really do this and do this well oftentimes will relate their success back to objective measures of data that most of their stakeholders can really easily understand. All right, I'm going to move on here. I want to talk a little bit about Riley's law of retail gravitation. And I'm going to, you know, Dr. Miller does a great job of taking this to the academic level. I'm going to be a little bit more practical about it. Riley's law was developed by William J. Riley in 1931, and it illustrates the extent to which customers are willing to travel longer distances to larger retail centers. And for a county like Hancock County, that's really very important. And the reason for that is we're a relatively small retail market centered between two very large retail markets in Slidell and St. Tammany Parish in Louisiana, and in Gulfport in Mississippi, which is obviously the second largest city in Mississippi. And if you see the slide in front of you, what I've shown here is drive times. A lot of retail developers now are looking at drive times when making location decisions. They want to understand what sort of population and what sort of customer market is based in relatively close driving proximity. And The hard and fast rules of that are sort of the curves of 10 minutes, 20 minutes, and 30 minutes. And if you look here, I've mapped from sort of the center of Hancock County's retail market on Highway 603 and Highway 90, and our 30-minute drive times actually extend out to the intersection of Highway 49 and Interstate 10, which is a very large retail corridor, and also the intersection of Interstate 10, Interstate 59, and Interstate 12 in Slidell, which is another very large retail corridor. And so with that in mind, we know that there is a lot of gravity occurring in the two counties and the parish on either side of us. And to put that in some sort of numerical form here is a little calculation where we're looking at the population of St. Tammany Parish and the population of Harrison County as opposed to Hancock County, the distance to those county centers, which allows us to come up with these retail gravity values, and essentially the percent of Hancock County trips that are likely to be taken to either St. Tammany Parish or Harrison County as a result of that. And so, this is something from a retail development perspective that we have to understand. Taking the retail analysis a step further, and I'm going to skip over here and about the trade area, and I'll come back to this, but we look at pull factors, and pull factors are extremely important, especially when you're doing retail economic data analysis. A pull factor is essentially a calculation that identifies how much retail business is leaving your community in comparison to the population. And going back to the slide we looked at earlier, we know that St. Tammany Parish and Harrison County are going to be pulling a lot of that retail business out of Hancock County. But how do we quantify that? Well, here I've got a calculation of Hancock County's pull factors based on fiscal year 2013 data. And most of the data in this file actually comes from either the Census Bureau or the State Tax Commission's annual report. And so essentially what we're looking at is Hancock County compared to Mississippi as a whole. And I'm going to oversimplify this a little bit, but essentially the philosophy behind this is that Mississippi as a whole has all of the non-basic retail sector business inside the state borders to serve the needs of the state's population. Now, that doesn't mean that folks don't drive across state borders to shop, but what it essentially means is that we are able to serve all of our population's needs based on the amount of business that's inside the state border. As a result of that, Mississippi has a pull factor of 1, which is essentially means that you're serving the entirety of the business and you're not having that business leak out. When we compare that, we look at the actual retail sales in Hancock County as compared to Mississippi based on the population to determine what those pull factors would be as it relates to Hancock County. And as you can see there, from a retail point of view, I think it really starts to prove what we talked about earlier in terms of the fact that we're losing that retail business to the neighboring counties. And let's just go through these for a second. You see there, automotive, we're at a pull factor of a 0.4. That's not really unusual from the standpoint that a market the size of Hancock County is unlikely to have all of the dealers and the brands that the consumers would ultimately want to buy. And so when I look at that, I'm not going to immediately say we have the ability to come and recruit a new automotive dealer in Hancock County, because that's really more of a consumer-driven and a brand-driven market. But nevertheless, a lot of folks that are buying automobiles a lot of the Hancock County residents that are buying automobiles are obviously not buying those inside Hancock County. Going down to machinery, equipment, and supplies, there again, a sector that is primarily going to be based in your larger retail markets. We come on down to food and beverage, and as you can see, we're there at a 0.9. Really, and I've heard other economists talk about pull factors, and Dr. Miller, I don't know if you want to jump in on this, but for the most part, anything that is a 0.75 and above really tells you that you're in a position that you're not having major leakages. And so even though we're not at a 1 there, if I'm a restaurateur and I'm looking at these numbers from a food and beverage perspective, I'm probably not going to see that there is a market that's going to be really conducive to success, considering that for the most part we're not losing a lot of those food and beverage sales. And of course, food and beverage is much different than something like the automotive industry, because that tends to be consumerism of convenience, and folks are likely to do that shopping and do their purchasing closer to home in those situations. So they're unlikely to drive farther, as opposed to buying an automobile, where you're certainly more likely to take a longer trip, depending on the variety of brands and the offerings that are available in the larger retail markets. Next, we look at furniture and fixtures. I will tell you an actual story based on these numbers. You can see there we're at a 0.1. There really aren't many furniture stores in Hancock County. I actually showed this exact slide with these exact numbers to a developer who has opened a Sears home store in an old big box center that had been vacant for a number of years. And they have reported that they've seen brisk sales and have been successful in their first few months. And so that's an actual example of seeing a need there where a lot of those potential sales are leaving the county, and showing a investor that there is an opportunity there to actually make some money if they can put those offerings closer to home. Dr. Miller mentioned that he would have expected more in food and beverage with your tourist market. I'm really glad you mentioned that, Dr. Miller, because it's kind of one of those common refrains that I have, and I'll be interested to see what you think once we get all the way through all the slides here. I hear folks talking all the time about the fact that we've got to really support our tourism economy in Hancock County. It's sort of the common refrain of the Chamber of Commerce. We have a tourism bureau in the county that works very hard on that. And I've had to go to a number of meetings where I've said, look, we're very supportive of developing the tourism market. We think it's very important for Hancock County's future. But as I look at the economic data in Hancock County, I do not see that we have a tourism economy. In fact, in many ways, when you start to look at those changes over time, I think what it's shown is that most of our tourism economy was based on second homeowners that lived in the county prior to Hurricane Katrina, that were bringing their disposable income and bringing their spending to the county on weekends. Many of those second homeowners lived in the New Orleans metro area, came here for their beach homes. When many of those homes were destroyed, those second homeowners did not return, and with them, a lot of that tourism spending sort of died out. And so with that in mind, looking at the hard data, we certainly don't look anything like Harrison County would, for example. Harrison County has a tourism economy, and a lot of the retail sectors would actually be base sectors in Harrison County as a result of that. But in Hancock County, our numbers really don't pan out that way. So as we go through this, that's something I'm going to continue to point out, sort of where do we see the tourism industry and the tourism impact show up. I'm going to move on from this. I will say, does anybody have an idea, and I'll stop for a second just to see if anyone has any ideas, about why we would have contracting at 2.1 when all of our other sectors are the pull factors are relatively low? Yeah, Richard got it right. Richard said Stennis Space Center. The interesting thing about that is when the State Tax Commission starts to record some of this data, a lot of the federal government folks and a lot of the private sector folks at Stennis Space Center are referred to as contractors. And so in the way that the data is collected, that's where we're starting to see that impact show up on our pull factors. And it's sort of another good point about the fact that sometimes you can't just look at the data, you've got to look at how the data is gathered, how the data is collected and classified to really understand what's behind it. And I've actually shown this slideshow when a few of the local contractors have been in the room. and they said, wow, we're not getting nearly that business. So that's something that requires a little bit more explanation. So it's a good example of having to really understand how the data is being collected and where it's coming from. All right, so any questions on this slide before we move on? All right, I'm going to move on to the next one here, and this is really, I think, an exercise that allows you to determine if your pull factors are accurate. To make really, it's kind of a check and balance on that information. And this is trade sales potential. I'm going to back up just a couple of slides here and show you our trade area. In a retail setting, trade area really refers to the specific geographic area where your customer and market base is coming from. So, for example, if I was doing this slideshow on Harrison County, which has Gulfport and Biloxi metropolitan areas, then likely the trade area would be larger than the county's borders itself. In Hancock County's situation, our trade area is actually smaller than the county's borders. It includes some of the western side of Pass Christian, which does a lot of their shopping down in Bay St. Louis. It includes the cities of Diamond Head, the cities of Waveland. But when you get into the community of Pearlington, which is sitting on the Louisiana state line, a lot of those shoppers are going and doing primarily all of their business in Slidell. Likewise, when you get into the north part of the county, up in the Kill, a lot of those shoppers are going to Picayune to do their shopping. And so with that in mind, our trade area is actually relatively small. But by taking the population inside that trade area and then using some economic data, we're able to look at trade sales potential. And this is similar to our pull factors, but what we're essentially looking at is, based on the spending of the Mississippi population as a whole and our per capita income as compared to Mississippi, what level of potential sales should our trade area population generate? And so it's another way of really looking at those pull factors. As you notice, our trade area population is about 39,303. Our county population is about 46,000 today. And those 39,000 people should be generating potential sales based on the Mississippi averages of about $83 million. And as you can see, Hancock County sales were about $35 million, which was about 42% captured. Interesting thing about that is our pull factor on automotive was a 0.4. And so when those numbers are close in agreement like that, I think what you really see is that you're getting a lot of accuracy in your data. Same with machinery, equipment, and supplies. That was at a 0.4. Here we're capturing about 51%. As you remember, our pull factor was a 0.9 on food and beverage. Here we're capturing 100%. I really like that number, and I like that number in this slide because I think it really shows that your formula is working the way it should. 39,303 people should have generated potential sales of $112 million, and our actual Hancock County sales for this year were $112 million. So it shows you that there is some logic behind the formula. Remember, in our earlier slide, our furniture and fixtures pull factor was a 0.1. Here that we see we're capturing about 0.08% of the total sales. Of course, when I run this again next year with the Sears Home Store, which has now been reopened, those numbers are going to have changed quite a bit. But there again, if you take a look at the earlier slides, you compare them to the slides I'm showing you here, what you'll see is those percent captured is actually in pretty close agreement with the pull factors, and so we see that we've got some accuracy in our data. I'll give you another sort of real-world story here. You see here that our lumber and building materials is at a percent captured of 1.12. I'm going to back up the slide here and show you lumber and building materials were at a pull factor of a 1. And in Hancock County, after Hurricane Katrina, there actually was a Home Depot and a Lowe's that both opened along with an existing 84 lumber store. Both Home Depot and Lowe's have now closed down. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Both Home Depot and 84 lumber have now closed down. Lowe's is still open, And so with that in mind, Lowe's is generating most of those lumber and building material sales inside the county. If my board members came to me and said, you know, Ashley, we really think that we ought to make a target for landing a new Home Depot store. You know, they were here after Katrina. A lot of folks liked Home Depot. Why can't we get Home Depot back? If I'm doing my job well, I'm able to pull these numbers out of my pocket and show this to my board and say, Home Depot is not going to make that investment here unless we either have an event which causes the demand for a large number of sales, or unless we drastically increase our population base. Because based on the current pull factors and the current trade sales potential versus the actual percent captured, we're actually capturing more than 100% of our potential sales, and actually pulling in some additional customers from outside of our market. So with that in mind, any good large retail business like a Lowe's or a Home Depot, they're going to look at similar market numbers. They're going to realize that likely Hancock County is not a market where they're going to be successful, and as a result of that, it's probably not a place that we ought to spend a whole lot of time and effort knowing what we know. And so that's the difference between really data-driven economic development and economic development which just says, you know, let me go try to get a Home Depot because I think it would be good for my community. There has to be sort of that pragmatic data analysis that goes on to really set your targets and be successful in this business. Moving on, you see that our contracting looks very similar there to our pull factors. But when you look at this overall, from an economic development standpoint, you can see right away that one of the things that we wanted to immediately target from a retail perspective was food and beverage, miscellaneous retail to a little bit to a smaller degree, but these are where we really generate our targets. All right, any questions before we move on to the next slide? Okay, so now we want to talk a little bit about base sector analytics. And you know, previously we've been talking primarily about retail sector analytics, retail sales, looking at how we analyze that data, how we actually put that data into practice. And now I want to talk about the base sector. So not so much what consumers that live in Hancock County are buying, but what types of goods and services are originating in Hancock County and being sold outside our county borders such that they are bringing new money into the county that wouldn't be here otherwise. And that's our base sector. I want to start off with a look at our gross regional product calculation. I really like gross regional product, and the reason I like that is because it measures the final market value of all the goods and services produced in a region. It's a sum of earnings, property income, and taxes. And I think that's important because a lot of times public policymakers look only at things like, you know, what were my taxes for the last year, or what were my sales taxes. And I think that you have to go a little beyond that, and as we get farther into this, I'm going to show you why. First slide I have here is Hancock County's gross regional product for 2012. Actually, there's some later numbers available, but I wanted to use this slide in particular because I wanted to be able to make a few points. The question comes back up, Dr. Miller asked earlier about our tourism economy. And so if the tourism economy in Hancock County was robust, then there are some areas here where I would see larger numbers. And of course, these are broken down into your 2-digit snakes codes. I know that probably all of you have now used NAICS codes. Some people call them NEX codes. I like to call it NAICS codes. And remember, those codes can go from 2 digits, which are very broad sectors of the economy, all the way to 6 digits, which get into very specific subsectors of larger industry sectors. For the purpose of this slide, I'm using the 2-digit sectors to look at sort of broad industry sectors. As I move on through the slideshow, I'm going to get into some very specific subsectors, and I think you guys will see why. But you look there at NAICS code number 44, our retail trade, that is about 5% of our total gross regional product. Compare that to manufacturing, which is about 8%. In a tourism economy, likely your retail trade numbers are going to be much higher. You go down to number 71 there, next code 71, which is the category 7. Arts, entertainment, and recreation, about 3% of our total gross regional product. Below that, accommodation and food services, about 5%. There again, in a tourism economy, those numbers are going to be much, much larger. Of course, the thing that stands out to you on the screen is government, 29% of our gross regional product. Anyone have any ideas as to why government would make up nearly a third of our entire gross regional product in Hancock County? Yeah, Wayne got that one. Stennis Space Center. A lot of folks think Stennis Space Center is primarily NASA-driven. Stennis Space Center is home to several Department of Defense organizations and operations, the Navy, NOAA, EPA, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. So huge federal government footprint at Stennis Space Center. And that shows you how important Stennis Space Center is to the Hancock County economy. In fact, I remember soon after I came into this job meeting with some members of our Board of Supervisors, and I was talking about the need to really begin marketing Stennis Space Center, and one of the members of the Board of Supervisors looked at me and said, well, why are you worried about Stennis Space Center? They don't even pay any taxes. This slide should answer that question. This is why we're worried about Stennis Space Center. In fact, several of the additional slides I'm going to show you will even further bring that point into focus. Okay, any questions before I leave this slide? All right, moving on to the next slide here. This is where we're getting into some of the data that we really look at very closely, and that is location quotients and shift share analysis. And I think you guys probably have some familiarity with these. Location quotient is essentially a way of quantifying how concentrated an industry is in a certain region. In this case, we're going to be looking at the concentration of particular industry sectors in Hancock County. And we're comparing that to the concentration in the nation as a whole. I have here, it can reveal what makes a particular region unique in comparison to the national average. And I know that you guys in this class are going to be talking a lot about cluster dynamics. Location quotients is one of the first things you want to do when you're doing a cluster analysis, because it can start to reveal data that is indicative of cluster dynamics in your region, in your county, in your city, whatever particular geographic distribution you're looking at. And of course, shift share is a standard regional analysis that attempts to determine how much regional job growth can be attributed to national trends and how much is due to unique regional factors. And so, for example, if we look at a shift share and see that our industry sectors are responding very much like the industry in the nation as a whole, then we can probably create some pretty good ideas of why things are changing over time in the way they are. However, if those numbers are skewed and we see that regional factors are having a much greater influence, then those are things that we really need to be making sure that we're affecting to the extent that we can. And so shift share and location quotient, otherwise known as LQ, are really two of your main tools in your toolkit. And I'm going to look at some here specifically based on Hancock County numbers. This is a little bit of a blurry slide. I wish that it was a little sharper. I hope you guys can see this. You'll notice here, if you look on the left side of the screen, I'm using the 6-digit NAICS codes, and I've literally taken the tens of thousands of 6-digit NAICS codes categories, and I've sorted these into a spreadsheet, and I think I've got the top 15 or so industries here based on the rank of location quotient. And right up there at the top, you see Stennis Space Center's impact in Hancock County, guided missile and space vehicle propulsion, a location quotient of 159.52. That's a highly specialized industry sector. It shows that we have a tremendous concentration of that industry sector inside Hancock County. As a result of that, if there are companies, if there are economic development projects out there that involve guided missile and space vehicle propulsion, and as an economic developer, I'm not working to land those in Hancock County, then they should fire me the next day. Because when I see that, what that tells me is I've got a knowledge base here, I've got a workforce that probably is going to be trained and familiar. I'm likely going to have workforce programs that are designed to support those type of efforts. And with that in mind, that's going to be one of my very clear industry targets. I see I got a question here. Robert asked if EMSI was my data source for this. Yes, Robert, EMSI was my data source for this. This slide I actually ran using the 2014.1 class of worker data set. I think EMSI now has 2014.1, .2, .3, and then a beta version of .4. So you could actually get a little bit newer data than what I have here on this slide because I ran it using the 2014.1 class of worker. Next, we see facility support services. That primarily refers to the support services that are occurring at Stennis Space Center. Let me back up 1 second because I forgot to tell you something that I really wanted to tell you. I was telling you how great it was that we had 159.52 location quotient as it related to guided missile and space vehicle propulsion. But as an economic developer, I should immediately be stunned to see that I've lost 100 jobs in that sector from 2001 to 2013, and my national location quotient has gone down from 210.73 to 159.52. So number one, I see there that I'm not as concentrated as I used to be in that particular industry sector, and I also see that I'm losing jobs in that industry sector. And I can actually give you the real world reasons that that's happened because of some things that have happened in the NASA budget and the fact that Stennis Space Center has become more diversified. There's less propulsion testing going on now and more marine science and technology and other things. But nevertheless, that's a tide that we really want to stem. I see a question here. Thomas asked, with there being a cluster in that industry, would you be hesitant to give incentives while trying to recruit a company in that industry since you have the workforce? And Thomas, I'm gonna answer your question by saying no. I would not be hesitant at all. In fact, I actually would probably be more inclined to want to give an incentive for an industry that was based on that cluster, because when you look at cluster dynamics, the strength of the cluster really contributes to the strength of the individual firms within the cluster. And so with that in mind, I would want to do everything I could to strengthen that cluster. But as I go on into a couple of other slides here, I want to come back to that question because I'm really going to draw a distinction between the value of incentives and the economic impact that some of these particular industry sectors have. I'm just going to go down through the rest of these pretty quickly. Casinos are third here on the list of 58.9. Remember what I said earlier about the tourism economy in Hancock County? You notice that we've lost 632 casino jobs since 2001. That's between 2001 and 2013. And the location quotient has become much less concentrated than the nation as a whole over that same 12-year period of time. Certainly indicative that we've got a tourism economy that is decreasing rather than increasing. You come here next to plastic material and resin manufacturing. That's where I start to see my industrial assets coming into play in my economic data. Port Bienville is home to 3 large plastic material and resin companies: DAC America, which makes PET plastics, S&F Polychemie, which makes polymers, and then Sabic Innovative Plastic, which makes polymers and plastics that are used in the automotive industry. And so you see there that we've actually had a change over from 2001 to 2013, a net increase of 11 jobs. I will tell you that I've actually run this scenario recently, and those jobs are up quite a bit more than that on my new numbers. So we're seeing positive economic indicators there. That's a cluster, a small cluster that I have inside of Port Bienville Industrial Park, something else that should be an industry target for me. After that, you see iron and steel pipe and tube manufacturing. You can see there were no jobs there in 2001. There were 109 in 2013. That entire industry sector is made up of one business in Hancock County. That business is Jindal Tubular USA. That they are a spirally arc welded steel pipe manufacturing firm, and that company actually opened its doors as PSL North America back in 2007. I will tell you here, you see 109 jobs there as of 2013. As of this week, they are employing 185 workers. So there again, good economic growth in that particular sector, and they use lots of skilled labor, welders, for example, very well-paid jobs. You see there the average earnings per job of $66,000. These are definitely the types of jobs that we want to continue to create in Hancock County. And if you look there at your average earnings, for example, in plastics, material, and resin manufacturing, you see that there's an average earning there of about $113,000 per job. Those are definitely the kind of jobs that I want to create. And as Felicity could tell you, when you look at our list of active economic development projects in Hancock County, you will see a whole bunch of plastic materials and resin manufacturers, and you will see a whole bunch of steel pipe companies on that list, because at the end of the day, those are the types of businesses that we're trying to land. Going on down through this list a little quicker here, you'll notice chemical and product and preparation manufacturing. Some of that chemical product and preparation is actually also recording our polymer firms. Those are also kind of called chemical firms in some situations, but generally the energy industry and some of the polymer industries are referred to as chemicals in an economic development setting. Dr. Miller asked steel pipe for oil and gas. The answer is yes. They actually make steel pipe both for water transmission and for oil and gas. Last year we had an opportunity to land a steel pipe manufacturer that made foundational steel pipe systems, and actually came very close to locating that company here. At the end of the day, we were dealing with a privately owned piece of property, and the property owner could not come to terms with the company on the property. However, we have actually put another company in that facility they're doing steel fabrication. So that gives you an example of how folks that are working in that steel working industry, welders and other skilled tradesmen, help us actually land some of these types of economic development projects that are similar. Most everything that you see on this sheet really brings into play Stennis Space Center, Port Bienville Industrial Park, and Stennis International Airport. I have one trivia question here for the class, and if anybody gets this, I think I'll owe you a steak dinner. Can anybody tell me why musical instrument manufacturing would be on this list? I see that our employee actually got it right, so I'm not going to actually give her a steak dinner because she cheated. But the answer is we actually have a company called Hot Sticks. I see Zeb got it right, so Zeb, you're the winner of a steak dinner. Hot Sticks actually manufactures drumsticks, and they are located at Stennis International Airport. They show that they have about 14 employees here. They're now up to about 20 because they're also making small miniature baseball bats that are used as they're sold like in the pro shop. So with that in mind, kind of a unique little business there that's located at our airport. But I'm glad that Zeb knew that, or either he copied Felicity. I'm not sure which one. All right, moving on to slide 20, and this is a slide that I've kind of kept for the end of some of the base sector discussion, and I think it's one of the slides that really I think every economic developer should have in their pocket, on their person all the time when they're talking to anybody, whether it's local elected officials, business leaders, stakeholders, and that is your exports. This is actually something you can get from EMSI. You can run this through EMSI. I encourage you all to do this for your project. And when you look at it, when you're talking about exports, I mean, think of it in terms of these are new dollars that are coming into the county. as a result of the base sector activity. And you can break this up into your 6-digit code sectors. You'll see here that the number 1 sector is federal government, civilian, excluding postal service. You remember earlier our government in the gross regional product category, the fact that government was about 29%. Here you can see that the federal government activity in Hancock County, it results in about $3 billion in export activity, and that is absolutely tremendous. So back to the question of that supervisor that asked me, why in the world are you worried about Stennis Space Center? They don't pay any taxes. Well, that's the answer right there. That's why. Because taxes are minuscule compared to the impacts that base sector activity is having in Hancock County. And the multiplier effects that creates throughout our entire economy is one of the main drivers that keeps Hancock County going. Now, with that in mind, one of the things I'll say is there's a difference between sort of good money and bad money. Good money is money that comes into your economy and stays there and recirculates. Bad money is money that comes into your economy and moves back across the geographic borders. In the case of the federal government impact, some of what we see there goes into Pearl River County, goes into St. Tammany Parish, and that's why one of our big initiatives with our local Chamber of Commerce is working on a relocation package to make sure that more of the government workers and the contractors and private sector workers at Stennis Space Center choose to live in Hancock County rather than living in St. Tammany Parish or Harrison County or some of the other places. And the reason for that is very clear. Those folks are going to be the folks that shop in the grocery stores, the folks that ultimately pay their property taxes, put their kids in school, folks that are going to drive your local economic activity. And so the fact that some of that money comes into our county and then also leaves our county is something that we've got to make sure that we're working to change. Let me just stop there for any questions. I noticed that we may have had a little technical difficulty there when I was giving that explanation. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, good deal. Next, you'll see the export activity of the plastics material and resin manufacturing industry. And you see that's about $301 million. That's all located inside Port Bienville Industrial Park. And so when I'm going to talk to anyone about the importance of Port Bienville Industrial Park, whether it's local elected officials, whether it's folks at MDA, when I'm looking for money for infrastructure, this is exactly the kind of data that I want to take with me, because I want to be able to show that 3 companies in Port Bienville Industrial Park are responsible for about $301 million in base sector export activity. That is really quite striking, and I want to take it a step further, and this is, I think, where you, from an economic development perspective, you really have to get into the numbers. I'm just going to go back one slide, and I want you to notice that that same subsector, plastic material and resin manufacturing, consists of about 248 employees. All right? Keep that number in mind, and let's compare it to the one immediately above that, casinos, which account for about 528 total employees. So almost 300 more employees in the county working in casinos than working in plastics material and resin manufacturing. Notice that the average earnings per job in casinos is about $32,000. The average earning in plastic material and resin manufacturing is about $113,000. And then I go over to the next slide here, and you notice that the economic impact of those 248 jobs is $301 million, whereas the economic impact of those casino jobs that we just saw farther down the page is at about $45.5 million. So if anyone ever says, are all jobs created equal, the answer is no. Are all economic development projects created equal? The answer is no. That's why, for example, that an economic developer in a place like Hancock County is going to spend much more time trying to get a polymer company in town than spending their time trying to develop a new gaming site. I'm not telling you shouldn't do both, but it certainly shows you where your priority should be. The same is true, for example, of the iron and steel pipe manufacturing. As you can see, NAICS code 331210, responsible for about $68 million in export activity. You compare that to casinos. Remember, iron and steel pipe manufacturing consisted of a little over 100 jobs, whereas casinos are closer to 600. I think something that's really interesting here is that casino hotels actually come in well above the actual casinos, and they're responsible for about $82 million in export activity. If we go back one slide to our previous slide, you will see that casino hotels consist of about 662 employees as opposed to the 528 that are in casinos. So for those of you guys that are interested in working in the tourism side, what that tells you is the hotels, the actual accommodations, are responsible for a very large share of the economic activity that goes on. So if you have attractions, your next job will be to make sure that you're getting good accommodations to go along with them, and that's how ultimately you can generate greater multiplier effects in your economy. In fact, in 2001, which is the earliest year in my study here, we did not have a casino hotel in Hancock County. When I ran these numbers, we had one casino hotel. Next year, a new casino hotel will have come online, and we will have two. And I fully expect that the casino hotel sector of the economy is going to well outpace the casino sector of the economy, meaning that hotels are actually more valuable to Hancock County than the casinos themselves, although certainly one could not exist without the other. So nevertheless, you see here how the various industry sectors are responsible for that base sector activity. And I want to go back to the question that Thomas asked earlier, and that was a question about incentives. And I think that a slide like this, as simple as it is, really tells you everything you need to know about incentives for the base sector. And that is this. For example, if I'm going to give $1 million tax abatement to a new polymer company in Hancock County, then likely there's going to be a lot of internal debate in the county about that. The Board of Supervisors are going to say, well, that's $1 million in revenue that we're going to take out of our pockets. How do we know that it's really worth it? Well, the answer is, look at the base sector economic activity that company is likely going to be responsible for. $1 million tax abatement is a drop in the bucket when you compare it to the payroll that's going on, all the new money that's coming into the county, and the fact that then those workers are going to be the folks that spend their paychecks shopping in your grocery stores, eating at your local restaurants, paying their property taxes, sending their kids to school. That's how economic development occurs. And so through data-driven development, we as economic developers should never be in a situation where we go before a board asking for incentives without being able to quantify the economic impact that business or that industry is going to have in our economy, and then compare that to the relatively small amount of incentives that it's going to take it to get there. And if you ever get into a situation where that comparison shows that the incentive is actually very high when compared with the economic impact, then chances are you need to rethink your incentives. I know I'm getting kind of short on time here, but I just want to ask the class if anyone wants to either type in or even speak up over your microphone, why would I want to give an incentive to a base sector industry over a non-base sector industry? So for example, why would I be more likely to give an incentive to a plastics company than I would be to a new retail shopping center? I see a lot of answers there. I think you're all right. And to be quite honest with you, I think this is one of the places where incentives are oftentimes misused. we often see examples of cities and counties that are doing TIF bonds and giving major incentives for retail businesses. And what I'm saying here is not always going to be a hard and fast rule. There are certainly some situations where that is justified. For example, if you're building a new regional mall that's going to bring tons of new shoppers from outside your county borders into your county, then that may be a good incentive. But for the most part, if you have a non-base sector activity that's recirculating money that's already there, then by incentivizing new businesses, you're only going to really be cannibalizing the businesses that already exist. And I'll give you a really simple example of that. If I have a McDonald's on the highway and I build a Burger King next to the McDonald's on the highway, then likely that Burger King is not going to double the fast food sales that are occurring along that highway. In fact, what's likely going to happen is that Burger King is going to take some of the business that McDonald's is already getting, but their total sales between the two stores is unlikely to be exponentially higher than it would have been if one of those stores was in place. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't want to have our new fast food offerings, but that's really a market-driven type of a business. And so there's not going to be a situation in which I'm going to want to incentivize a Burger King coming in next to a McDonald's, because at the end of the day, that should be driven by consumer demand, and at the end of the day, we should make sure that we're not putting money into the hands of a business that's only going to recirculate money that's already here. Does that make sense to everyone? Yeah, I see a question here. Michael asked, could there be a critical mass of restaurants that would affect the number of people who choose to stop at a good exit? Very good question, Michael, and I'll give you a great real-world example of that. In Hancock County, Diamond Head is located on Interstate 10. And Hancock County is really sort of behind the curve when it comes to interstate visible retail developments. We have very little development directly along the interstate. And so as it relates to retail development, say in downtown Bay St. Louis or downtown Waveland, probably something that we're not going to want to put a lot of incentives into. But as it related to potentially a new critical mass of, say, restaurants or retail stores that could locate on the interstate, that's something that we might want to put a TIF bond into, because we're going to be primarily getting folks that shop there that are going to be coming from across the county borders. The consumers that go to those restaurants are not just going to be locals. There'll be a lot of folks that are traveling along interstate with those high traffic counts. They're going to pull off the interstate. They're going to stop there. They're going to eat. They're going to shop. They're going to spend their money in Hancock County. So that's a perfect example of a situation where you might want to create an incentive. And that's exactly why you have to be able to look at the data. You've got to be able to really analyze the situation to determine, are we going to be bringing in new money, or are we going to be essentially incenting money that's already here, that's already recirculating? And that is, at the very core of our job as economic developers. Okay, with that in mind, any other questions on this slide before I move on? I've got just a couple of more. I see Richard has asked the question, what about developing 603 north of 10 with hotel restaurants? Richard, I will tell you, the question you ask is something that, is something we deal with day to day. On its face, it would seem that Interstate 603 and the intersection there of 603 and I-10 would be probably the single best retail development site in Hancock County. And it is, with one pretty striking exception. Most of the land that's located there is sitting about 5 to 8 feet above sea level. It's in the floodplain. Some of it is actually located in a velocity zone. With that in mind, you can't bring in fill into some of those areas to raise the elevation, and most of the retail businesses and the restaurants, especially the chains that are looking for interstate visibility, are not going to locate into a place where they would have to build up 13 or 14 feet in elevation off of the ground level. I can tell you that we have run a number of very good retail developers through that site. We are, as we speak, working on a hotel development for that site. I would have a Cracker Barrel sitting there today if I had a parcel that was sitting at 20 feet above sea level. Cracker Barrel, and you look at their customer base, they are simply not going to create a facility that's elevated. And with that in mind, the elevation at that area has been a real detriment to development. So even though you've got great traffic counts, great transportation infrastructure right there in that area, there are some other geographic and natural features that are working against the ability to effectively develop that into the retail center that we all hope it would be. And that's something that we really deal with every day, because we're looking for ways ultimately to be able to mitigate that property such that we can put retail development there and take advantage of those traffic counts on I-10. So thanks for that question. That was a really good question. Okay, I'm going to move on here and go through these last few slides. I just want to give you some other quantifiable economic development measures. These are things that I look at every day. Jobs data, extremely important. I like to break these down into NAICS codes categories. Where are my jobs located in Hancock County? You'll notice there are a lot of jobs in retail trade. You can see that those jobs are not always going to be the highest paying jobs, because when you compare that bar graph to where retail trade was in terms of our gross regional product, it was only at about 5%. And so when you start to look at these numbers and you start to compare different charts, that's really what starts to tell the story of your local economy. The other thing is, you want to look at these regularly. You want to make sure that you're tracking the changes over time, because that's also going to tell a story of what's happening in your local economy. So even though a static shot like this, which are the 2012 numbers, even though that's really good for me to be able to look at, what's even more important is the fact that I'm going to be making sure that I'm looking at these numbers month to month, quarter to quarter, year to year, seeing how they're changing, and making sure that we are adjusting and responding to those changes as they go forth. Okay, my next slide here is some quantifiable gauges, and I've listed 4 gauges here. I think these are great gauges. I think for every economic developer, they ought to have gauges like this. You can almost look at them like an instrument cluster, on your car dashboard. Here are the 4 things I want to look at. I want to look at investment figures. Put simply, I want to look at money. The amount of new investment, the value of new construction that's occurring in my county, how our property taxes are increasing or decreasing, how our sales taxes are increasing, decreasing, our gross regional product numbers, which include our taxes on production, our wages, our property. Those are all, hard dollar sign figures that I want to be looking at, and I want to be looking at how those things are changing over time. The second gauge are quantifiable demographic statistics. Those are really people-centric numbers. And so examples of that would be the net migration into or out of the region, the number of new jobs that are created, the number of new jobs that are lost. Breaking those down into industry sectors are very important. How many times have you heard a politician, for example, say, we created 100 new jobs? Well, you hear that all the time, but the question that you ought to ask is, you created 100 of which kind of new jobs? Because as I've shown you earlier, 100 new jobs in the aerospace industry or in the polymer sector, as opposed to 100 new jobs in food services, are going to be very, very different in how they're going to affect the local economy. So with that in mind, not only the number of jobs, but where those jobs were created, what industry sectors, our unemployment rate, almost as importantly, our underemployment rate. Not just how many folks are unemployed in your county, but how many of those folks are underemployed, meaning that they have skills that should allow them to be employed in a better wage job, but for whatever reason they're not able to do that. And we actually have some pretty good labor studies that we look at that tell us those things. Income and wage measures, and then the relative increases and decreases there. I noticed here that Serge had a question. he said, would you look at how that money and other indicators, those are related to your activities, or if they're just happening on their own as part of the default dynamism in the community? Serge, we want to make sure that we're looking at how those are directly affected by our activities. And many times when you look at this information, you're going to immediately see things that are playing out that you already know about. For example, new businesses that are opening, businesses that are closing, new retail centers that may have opened, population shifts. You're going to start to see that really play out in the data. But good economic developers are the folks that are able to say, here are the projects that we worked during the last year, here are the jobs that were created by those projects, and then here were the effects that we saw in the local economy as a result of that new investment and the spending power of those new workers. And when you can put that together and show that to a political board or show that to your board of directors, you're going to be very, very successful in your job, especially if you're able to show positive increases in that over time. I see Flint asked a question here, where would you get the underemployment rate information? You can actually get some of that from census data, Flint. We actually pay folks to go and do labor studies to help us do that. A lot of times the electric utilities, Mississippi Power, for example, here in the southern part of the state, updates labor studies for the counties pretty regularly. That's one of the things they pay for. And in fact, the most recent underemployment data I have came from a firm called Pathfinders, and the Pathfinders firm did a labor study here in Hancock County that we've been looking at, and it was funded by Mississippi Power. Okay, moving on, gauge 3 here are our property measures. First we talked about quantifiable investment numbers, money. Second, we talked about people. Third, we're looking at property. So occupancy, vacancy rates of property, of development sites, the increase or the decrease in the appraised property values, things that you can get from your local tax assessor's office, your number of residential properties listed on MLS. That's something that's oftentimes overlooked, but if I'm trying to land a company that's going to employ 1,000 new workers and I only have 100 houses for sale in my region on the MLS, then I'm going to have to do something to try to mitigate that in order to land that business. And I'll actually give you a real-world example of that. About a year ago, I was working a very large project. It was a Boeing project. It was for the 777X, which is one of Boeing's aircraft. It was an assembly and manufacturing project, a $3 billion initial capital investment, and 3,000 employees. Well, a project of that size is really a regional project. I've got about 1.5 million people in my labor shed because of the New Orleans metro area, the St. Tammany Parish, the North Shore, Harrison County, Jackson County, and Mobile. And so I'm able to compete for a project like that. But if I was in a rural area and I was in a county of 46,000 people with a couple of hundred houses on the MLS, and I'm trying to compete for a 3,000 employee project, chances are I'm not going to be very successful because I simply do not have the labor shed to be able to support that project. So residential properties listed on MLS is actually very important, and more times than not, site selectors and others will want you to send them MLS listings so they can take a look at that. And of course, residential construction numbers is something that also goes into that. And then my fourth gauge is your location quotients. That's your data-driven economic development, your location quotients, your shift shares, understanding the concentrations of your industries, understanding what makes your particular county or your particular market unique, and what kind of clusters you have. If you're looking at your money figures, your population figures, your property figures, and you really understand your clusters and what makes your county unique, then chances are you're going to be able to conduct data-driven development. And those are really, really important for that particular outcome. And I think I'm just about to the end of my slides here. I have one quick activity. Dr. Miller, I don't know if you think we have enough time. If you'd like to go ahead and do this, then we can. If not, we can go ahead and, okay. Dr. Miller said let's go ahead and do it. Okay, what I've given you here is a slide that essentially shows the change in jobs from 2001 to 2013, and then the comparative changes in the nation for those jobs in the two-digit NAICS codes categories. The reason that I want to show you guys this slide is because this is actually the exact information that I looked at when I began this job in 2013. I wanted to see what was happening in our local economy as it related to jobs as compared to the national economy. So with that in mind, if you guys wouldn't mind, and you can either speak up or type into the text box, tell me some things that you would, some conclusions that you would draw from looking at this sheet if you were an economic developer in Hancock County. And as a result of those conclusions, what sort of things, what sort of additional data would you want to look at? So I'll be quiet for a few minutes, and you guys can type in some conclusions that you draw from taking a look at this. And also, while we're doing that, if you guys have any questions, I can go ahead and field those now, so we can have to do those afterwards. So any questions you have or any comments you want to make about that slide? I see Thomas mentioned there that he would like to look at the accommodation and food services, what companies came in, are there room for more? Thomas, that makes a lot of sense to me. You know, what's causing those changes in accommodation and food services? You know, you notice there that we've had a pretty significant change, 57% as compared to 17% in the nation. So those are very specifically some things that we want to look at, and in determining, you know, not only number one, where are those changes occurring, but number two, you know, what can we do to try to increase that? I'll tell you one thing that really struck me when I saw this for the first time was look at arts, entertainment, and recreation as compared to accommodation and food services. If you looked only at accommodation and food services, you may say, well, gosh, surely you have a tourism economy. But above that, you see entertainment and recreation, that we actually had a 92% decrease in our percentage change over that period of time. So those two things conflict in some ways, especially when you look at what happened in the nation as a whole. And so that's the kind of place that an economic developer is going to want to look much, much deeper and try to understand what's going on there. See, several of you guys have mentioned the accommodation food services. Richard mentioned healthcare jobs, residual of Katrina. I think that's exactly the reason. I think Katrina would be directly responsible for that, for the healthcare and social assistance section. Richard, I think you're right about that. Serge mentioned that looking at the most prominent sectors and the declining sectors and comparing all that with benchmarkable goals. I think you're right on the mark there. Having some way to benchmark this, you know, that's certainly a way that you can actually put some of this data into practice. Caitlin mentioned that over half the industries are declining in jobs. You know, asking where are the companies going, what's going on. She sees those negative numbers. As you can see there, we really only had three sectors: wholesale trade, accommodation and food services, and government, that increased at a rate greater than the nation. So, Caitlin, you're exactly right. Those are definitely things that we would want to look at. Robert mentioned the decrease in information. You know, Robert, I actually am not sure if that includes sort of information technology. I would think that information technology would probably go under a different category here. especially as it related to like a lot of the IT workers and things at Stennis Space Center. So that may not be giving us a really good, clear picture of what's going on from sort of the information and technology sector. Wayne asked a question here about the difference in the approach to ED in the rural areas as opposed to the coastal and urban industrial areas. You know, I'll give you a couple of examples there. Our rural areas are actually where most of our industrial assets are located, and so in some ways, when we're looking at the rural areas, we're oftentimes looking for the availability of land for industrial development. A lot of industrial developers are going to be looking for a number of different things, but you know, large greenfield sites, access to good infrastructure, and most importantly, not being encroached on by a lot of residential development. And so, so from an industrial standpoint, we're oftentimes looking at our rural areas to try to create new industrial sites. Urban areas are much different. You know, for example, when I go and see the City Council of Bay St. Louis or the City Council of Waveland, you know, I'm generally not going to be talking to them about doing industrial development inside the city limits. Most of the time, I'm going to be talking to them about how the industrial development that I'm doing in the rural areas of the county ultimately will lead to increased population inside the city limits, increased consumer spending inside the city limits. And so from a urban side or a coastal side, that would be where we're looking at more of your retail sector, your tourism sector. How do we grow that? For example, after Katrina in Hancock County, there were a lot of programs aimed at trying to rebuild downtown and Old Town Bay St. Louis, making sure that the relatively small tourism draw that we had there came back better than it was before. A lot of that has come back. Of course, the problem that we're seeing is that we're not seeing the level of spending in those areas that we did pre-Katrina. So that's really a challenge. It's something that our Chamber of Commerce puts an awful lot of time into, trying to figure out how to spur tourism and spur spending back in those urban and sort of coastal areas of Hancock County. I see that Serge asked, why is arts and entertainment declining so much? Serge, the reason that I would tell you is that I think that ties pretty directly to a couple of things. Number one would be the decreases we've seen in casino jobs. The second would be things like movie theaters that existed before that have closed down, a Blockbuster store, something like that may have been classified under entertainment that's no longer there. So that's where we would start to see some of those job losses occurring. Okay, I think I'm just about finished up here. If there are any more questions, or Dr. Miller, anything else I can touch on, thank you guys so much. You've been great, and I really enjoyed this. I love talking about Hancock County's economy, and I'll be glad to